Picture this. It's 1509 off the coast of India. A massive fleet of over 200 war vessels surrounds just 18 Portuguese ships. The odds, more than 10 to 1. The enemy, battle-hardened pirates and warriors who've ruled these waters for centuries. Most commanders would surrender. Most crews would panic. But Captain Francisco de Almeida looked at those odds and said, "Let them come." What happened next would change naval warfare forever and prove that sometimes it's not about the size of your fleet, it's about the fury of your cannons. This is the story of how a handful of Portuguese ships crushed the most feared pirates of the East and became masters of the Indian Ocean. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you love epic historical battles and underdog victories, smash that subscribe button and hit the like button right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Let me take you back to the late 15th century. I'm standing on the docks of Lisbon, watching ships prepare for journeys that most people think are suicide missions. The year is 1498, and Vasco da Gama has just returned from India with news that's about to change Portugal forever. He's found a sea route to the east, bypassing the Ottoman-controlled land routes that have made spices worth more than gold in Europe. Now you might be wondering, why did Portugal care so much about reaching the east? Let me paint you a picture of medieval Europe. Imagine paying the equivalent of a small house for a bag of pepper. That's not an exaggeration. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves and nutmeg were so valuable that they were literally used as currency. A pound of nutmeg could buy you a cow. These weren't just luxury items for the wealthy. They were essential for preserving food, making medicine, and making terrible medieval food actually taste decent. But here's the problem. Every single spice that reached Europe had to pass through multiple middlemen. First, they went from India and Southeast Asia to Arab traders, then from Arab traders to Venetian merchants, then from Venetian merchants to the rest of Europe. Each middleman added their markup, and by the time a simple bag of pepper reached London or Paris, its price had increased by 1,000% or more. Portugal saw an opportunity. If they could sail directly to India, cut out all the middlemen, and bring spices directly to Europe, they'd become unimaginably wealthy. King Manuel I of Portugal wasn't just interested in exploration. He was interested in creating a commercial empire that would make Portugal the richest nation in Europe. But here's what most people don't understand about Portugal's expansion into the Indian Ocean. They weren't entering empty waters. They were crashing a party that had been going on for over 1,000 years. The Indian Ocean had its own complex network of trade, its own power structures, and its own rules. Arab merchants had been trading across these waters since before Muhammad walked the earth. Chinese treasure fleets under Admiral Zheng He had sailed these routes just decades earlier, with ships that dwarfed anything Europe could build. And then there were the pirates. When I say pirates, I need you to forget everything you think you know from Hollywood movies. These weren't ragtag crews of misfits sailing around looking for merchant ships to rob. The pirates of the Indian Ocean were organized, well-funded, and often backed by powerful rulers. Some were essentially private navies for competing kingdoms. Others were independent operators who'd built their own fortified bases on strategic islands. The most powerful of these groups were the Mamluks of Egypt, who controlled the Red Sea, and various Muslim rulers along the Indian coast, who saw the Portuguese as Christian invaders, threatening not just their profits, but their way of life. These weren't people who were going to politely step aside and let Portugal take over. So when Portuguese ships first arrived in Indian waters, they weren't greeted with open arms and curiosity. They were greeted with suspicion, hostility, and often violence. The Portuguese had superior ships and cannons, but they were vastly outnumbered. Every Portuguese captain knew that one wrong move, one miscalculation, could mean watching his entire crew be killed or enslaved. The Portuguese strategy was bold, some would say insane. They would establish fortified trading posts, called feitorias, at key locations around the Indian Ocean. These weren't just warehouses, they were military installations designed to project Portuguese power. And between these fortresses, Portuguese warships would patrol the seas, demanding that all merchant vessels purchase a cartaz, essentially a protection pass that allowed them to trade under Portuguese protection. Any ship that didn't have a cartaz? Fair game. The Portuguese would seize the cargo and often the ship itself. This wasn't just about controlling trade, it was about sending a message. The rules had changed, and Portugal was now in charge. But establishing this dominance wasn't going to be easy. The Portuguese faced enemies on all sides. Muslim traders who dominated these waters for centuries saw the Portuguese as Christian crusaders threatening their livelihoods and their faith. Hindu kingdoms were suspicious of these foreign newcomers making demands, and the pirates, they saw the Portuguese as competition that needed to be eliminated. Everything was building toward a confrontation. The rulers of the Indian Ocean weren't going to accept Portuguese dominance without a fight, and that fight, when it came, would be one of the most lopsided naval battles in history. Now let me introduce you to the people who actually controlled the Indian Ocean when the Portuguese arrived. And when I call them pirates, I'm using the Portuguese term. These were the Malabar Corsairs, the Gujarati naval forces, the Mamluk fleet, and dozens of other groups that the Portuguese lumped together as enemies of Christendom. The most powerful naval force the Portuguese faced was the combined fleet of the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and the Gujarat Sultanate. The Mamluks controlled Egypt and the Red Sea, which meant they controlled the traditional route for spices heading to Europe through Venice. The Portuguese arrival in India was an existential threat to them. If Portugal could buy spices directly from India and sail them around Africa to Europe, the Mamluk economy would collapse. The Sultan of Gujarat had his own reasons to hate the Portuguese. Gujarat was one of the wealthiest regions in India, and its prosperity was built on maritime trade. Gujarati merchants had trading connections stretching from East Africa to Southeast Asia. The Portuguese, with their demands for cartazes and their attacks on Muslim ships, were disrupting centuries-old trading networks. Let me tell you what made these fleets so formidable. First, they had numbers. When the Mamluk-Gujarat alliance assembled their fleet to fight the Portuguese, they could put hundreds of vessels to sea. Not just warships, but transport vessels, supply ships, and smaller craft. They could sustain a naval campaign far from home ports in ways that stretched Portuguese logistics to the breaking point. Second, they had experience. These weren't sailors learning on the job. These were men who'd spent their entire lives on these waters. They knew every current, every wind pattern, every hidden reef. They knew which islands had fresh water, where to beach a ship for repairs, how to navigate by stars that Portuguese sailors had never seen before. Third, they had courage. I know that sounds obvious, but I need to emphasize this point. These weren't cowards running from a fight. When Mamluk and Gujarati ships closed with Portuguese vessels, they did so knowing that Portuguese cannons would tear through their hulls. They did so anyway, because this was their home and they were defending it. The tactics these eastern fleets used were sophisticated. They understood that Portuguese ships had superior artillery, so they tried to close distance quickly, getting inside the range where Portuguese cannons couldn't be brought to bear effectively. They used fireships, vessels packed with combustibles and set ablaze, then sailed toward Portuguese ships, hoping to set them on fire. They used sheer numbers, trying to surround Portuguese vessels and board them from multiple directions simultaneously. One of their most effective tactics was the use of lighter, more maneuverable vessels called garabs or oared galleys. These ships could move regardless of wind conditions. While Portuguese carracks needed wind to maneuver, garabs could row directly toward them, change direction instantly, and withdraw quickly. It was like fighting cavalry with infantry. The Gurabs had a mobility advantage that Portuguese ships couldn't match. The pirates also understood psychological warfare. They would sometimes capture Portuguese sailors and parade them in chains through Indian ports, showing local populations that these foreigners weren't invincible. They spread stories about Portuguese cruelty, which were often true, to unite various Indian Ocean powers against the common enemy. And let's be honest about something. From the perspective of most people living around the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese were the bad guys in this story. Imagine you're an Indian or Arab merchant who's been trading peacefully across these waters your entire life. Your father traded these routes, your grandfather traded these routes. Then one day, foreign ships show up, speaking a language you don't understand, demanding you pay them for the privilege of sailing waters your people have sailed for 1,000 years. And if you refuse, they sink your ship and steal your cargo. The Portuguese called this establishing order and civilizing trade. Everyone else called it piracy. The most feared of all the Eastern naval commanders was Malik Ayaz, the admiral of the Gujarat fleet. This man was a legend. Born a slave, he'd risen through the ranks to become one of the most powerful men in Gujarat. He wasn't just a military commander, he was a skilled diplomat and strategist who understood that defeating the Portuguese required unity among the various Indian Ocean powers. Malik Ayaz did something remarkable. He convinced the Mamluks of Egypt to send their fleet all the way to India to fight alongside Gujarat. This was unprecedented. The Mamluk fleet had to sail from the Red Sea down the east coast of Africa, then across to India. It was a voyage of thousands of miles, and getting a fleet that far from home was a logistical nightmare. But Malik Ayaz understood that without Mamluk help, Gujarat couldn't defeat the Portuguese alone. When the combined Mamluk-Gujarat fleet finally assembled, it was the most powerful naval force the Indian Ocean had seen in generations. Over 200 vessels, including large Mamluk galleys equipped with heavy artillery, Gujarati war dhows, and countless smaller support craft. Thousands of soldiers and sailors, many of them veterans of previous battles against the Portuguese. This fleet had one mission: destroy Portuguese naval power in the Indian Ocean, drive them back to Europe. Make sure they never returned, and standing in their way, 18 Portuguese ships. So how did the Portuguese possibly think they could take on these massive eastern fleets with so few ships? The answer lies in naval technology, and specifically in one type of ship, the carrack. Let me explain what made Portuguese carracks so revolutionary. When most people think of ships from this era, they imagine wooden vessels that all look pretty similar. But the differences between a Portuguese carrack and the ships used by Eastern navies were as dramatic as the difference between a modern aircraft carrier and a wooden sailboat. First, let's talk about hull construction. Portuguese carracks were built with thick, heavy wooden planks, reinforced with internal bracing. The hull wasn't just strong, it was incredibly resistant to damage. When a cannonball hit a carrack's hull, it often didn't penetrate all the way through. Compare this to the lighter vessels used by Eastern navies, where a single cannonball could go straight through one side and out the other, devastating everything in between. Second, the carracks were tall. I mean really tall. These ships had multiple decks rising high above the waterline. This height gave Portuguese gunners a huge advantage. They could fire down onto enemy ships, and gravity made their shots even more devastating. Meanwhile, enemy ships firing up at carracks found their shots losing energy as they climbed, making them less effective. Third, and most importantly, the carracks were essentially floating artillery platforms. A typical Portuguese carrack in the early 1500s carried between 20 and 40 cannons. These weren't small guns, they were heavy bronze cannons that could fire iron or stone balls weighing 10 to 30 pounds each. At close range, these cannons could tear through multiple enemy ships with a single shot. But here's what made Portuguese gunnery truly revolutionary. They didn't just mount cannons on the deck. They cut gun ports into the sides of the hull, creating multiple decks of artillery. This meant a Portuguese ship could bring its broadsides to bear, firing dozens of cannons from one side of the ship all at once. The noise alone was terrifying. Sailors who experienced Portuguese broadsides described it as like being in a thunderstorm, where every lightning bolt was trying to kill you. The Portuguese also pioneered standardized ammunition and gun crews. Each cannon had a trained crew that knew exactly what to do: load, aim, fire, reload. They practiced until they could fire and reload in under 3 minutes. This rate of fire meant that by the time an enemy ship closed distance with a Portuguese vessel, it had already been hit by multiple broadsides. Now, these carracks weren't perfect. They were slow and difficult to maneuver compared to the lighter dhows and gurabs used by Eastern navies. They required deep water ports and couldn't navigate shallow coastal waters effectively. They were expensive to build and maintain, and replacing them far from Portugal was nearly impossible. But in open water naval battles, they were nearly invincible. The Portuguese had essentially brought the medieval castle to sea. Their ships were fortresses that could move and fire in all directions. Let me give you a specific example. The São Gabriel, one of the ships that Vasco da Gama took on his first voyage to India. This carrack was about 85 feet long and 25 feet wide, with a displacement of around 200 tons. It carried a crew of about 60 men and mounted 20 cannons. In a battle off the Indian coast, the São Gabriel faced 7 dhows simultaneously. The dhows attempted to board the carrack, getting close enough that the two sides were exchanging arrows and small arms fire. But the São Gabriel's cannons, firing at point-blank range, simply tore the dhows apart. Wooden planks exploded into splinters. Masts collapsed. Within an hour, all 7 dhows were sinking or had withdrawn. The São Gabriel suffered minor damage and only 3 wounded crew members. This wasn't just a victory, it was a demonstration of technological superiority so overwhelming that it changed the strategic calculations of every power in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese also made continuous improvements to their ships based on battle experience. After early encounters showed that fire ships were a major threat, they started soaking their sails in water and carrying buckets of sand to extinguish fires. When they learned that boarding was the greatest danger, they installed nets and barriers that made it harder for enemy sailors to climb aboard. Portuguese captains also developed specific tactics to maximize their advantages. They would try to fight in open water where they had room to maneuver and enemy ships couldn't surround them. They would position their ships in line formation, each one covering the next, creating a moving fortress of overlapping cannon fire. They would aim for enemy masts and rigging, trying to disable ships rather than sink them, because disabled ships could be captured and added to the Portuguese fleet. But perhaps the most important advantage Portuguese ships had wasn't technological at all. It was the men who sailed them. Portuguese sailors in this era were some of the most skilled and experienced in the world. They'd survived the voyage around Africa, which meant navigating some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. They'd dealt with storms, diseases, and months away from home. These were tough, professional sailors who'd been trained to fight as much as to sail, and they believed they were on a divine mission. Remember, this was the era of religious crusades. Portuguese sailors saw themselves as Christian warriors, bringing civilization to pagan lands. This wasn't just about profit, it was about faith. That kind of conviction makes men willing to fight against impossible odds. So when Portuguese captains looked at a fleet of 200 enemy vessels, they didn't see hopeless odds. They saw targets. They saw ships that couldn't stand up to their cannons. They saw enemies who didn't understand modern naval warfare. And they were right. Now we come to the moment everything has been building toward, the Battle of Due. This wasn't just another naval skirmish. This was the battle that would determine who controlled the Indian Ocean for the next century. Let me set the scene. It's February 1509. The combined Mamluk-Gujarat fleet, over 200 vessels strong, has been searching for the Portuguese fleet for weeks. They've been raiding Portuguese positions, capturing Portuguese sailors, and spreading the word that the foreigners' days are numbered. The Portuguese viceroy, Francisco de Almeida, has been gathering his forces. He's managed to assemble 18 ships and about 200 men. Some of his captains are advising him to retreat, to wait for reinforcements from Portugal. The odds are simply too overwhelming, but Almeida has personal reasons for wanting this fight. The previous year, his son Lorenzo de Almeida was killed in a battle against a combined Mamluk-Gujarat force. Francisco de Almeida isn't just fighting for Portugal or for trade routes. He's fighting for revenge. On February 2nd, 1509, the two fleets sight each other near the port of Diu in Gujarat. The stage is set for one of the most lopsided battles in naval history. I want you to imagine what this looked like. On one side, a massive fleet stretching across the horizon, hundreds of sails, thousands of men, ships of every size and description, the sound of drums and horns and prayers. This was the assembled might of the Islamic powers of the Indian Ocean, and they were confident of victory. On the other side, 18 Portuguese carracks formed up in a tight defensive formation. The Portuguese could see they were outnumbered, but they'd faced bad odds before. They'd sailed halfway around the world to get here. They weren't about to turn back now. Almeida's battle plan was simple but brilliant. He ordered his ships into a line formation, each one positioned to support the others. The Portuguese wouldn't try to outmaneuver the enemy fleet. They'd create a moving fortress that would blast anything that came close. The battle began at dawn. The Mamluk-Gujarat fleet advanced in a massive formation, trying to surround the Portuguese ships. Their strategy was to overwhelm the Portuguese with sheer numbers, board the carracks, and take them in hand-to-hand combat. What happened next must have been absolutely terrifying for the attacking fleet. As the first wave of Mamluk and Gujarati ships came within range, the Portuguese opened fire. All 18 ships, all their cannons, firing as fast as the crews could reload. The sound would have been deafening, the smoke would have been blinding, and the carnage would have been indescribable. Portuguese cannons, firing iron and stone balls weighing 20 to 30 pounds, tore through the lighter enemy vessels like they were made of paper. A single shot could sink a small dhow. A cannonball passing through one ship might hit 2 or 3 others behind it. The first wave of attackers was decimated within minutes. Ships were sinking, on fire, or withdrawing with massive casualties. But the Mamluk-Gujarat commanders weren't giving up. They sent in more ships, wave after wave, trying to get past the cannon fire and board the Portuguese vessels. Some of them made it. A few Gujarati Gurabs managed to close with Portuguese ships and throw grappling hooks over the rails. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out on the decks of several Portuguese carracks. These were desperate, brutal fights. Portuguese soldiers, armed with swords and pikes, against Gujarati and Mamluk warriors who were equally determined to win. But the Portuguese had prepared for this. They'd stationed marines specifically to repel boarders, and the height of the carracks gave them an advantage. Enemy sailors climbing up the sides of Portuguese ships were easy targets. More importantly, while the boarding actions were happening on one side of a carrack, the Portuguese cannons on the other side kept firing, devastating more enemy ships. The battle raged for over 8 hours. By midday, the waters around Diu were filled with wreckage and bodies. The Mamluk-Gujarat fleet had lost dozens of ships sunk and dozens more disabled. Portuguese cannonballs had killed hundreds, possibly thousands of enemy sailors and soldiers. And then, the Mamluk flagship, the pride of the Egyptian fleet, made one final push. This was a massive galley, larger than anything the Portuguese had, carrying heavy artillery and hundreds of elite Mamluk warriors. If the Mamluks could destroy even one Portuguese ship, they might inspire the rest of the fleet to rally. Almeida himself commanded the Portuguese response. 3 Portuguese carracks concentrated their fire on the Mamluk flagship. Cannonball after cannonball slammed into its hull. The mast was shot away. The rigging collapsed. Fires broke out on multiple decks. The Mamluk flagship, the symbol of Islamic power in the Indian Ocean, slowly listed to one side and then capsized, taking hundreds of men down with it. Its loss broke the will of the attacking fleet. The Mamluk-Gujarat alliance had thrown everything they had at the Portuguese and failed. Now their ships began to withdraw, and the withdrawal quickly became a rout. Portuguese ships pursued, capturing or sinking fleeing vessels. By sunset, the Battle of Diu was over. The Portuguese had lost not a single ship. Casualties were minimal, maybe 50 or 60 men killed or wounded. The Mamluk-Gujarat fleet had lost over 100 ships and thousands of men. It was one of the most one-sided naval victories in history. 18 ships had defeated a fleet of over 200. It shouldn't have been possible, but superior technology, superior tactics, and superior training had overcome impossible odds. The Battle of Diu didn't just establish Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean. It fundamentally changed how everyone thought about naval warfare. Guns mattered more than numbers. Artillery mattered more than boarding actions. The age of the galley was ending, and the age of the sailing warship was beginning. For the Portuguese, Diu was vindication. They'd proven that they couldn't be driven from the Indian Ocean. Their strategy of fortified bases connected by powerful warships would work. Portugal would dominate the spice trade for decades to come. For the Mamluk Sultanate, Diu was a disaster. They'd sent their best fleet halfway around the world, and it had been destroyed. They would never again challenge Portuguese power at sea. Within a few years, the Mamluk Sultanate would fall to the Ottoman Turks, and some historians argue that their loss at Diu contributed to that downfall. For Gujarat and the other Indian Ocean powers, Diu was a harsh lesson. The Portuguese couldn't be defeated through conventional naval warfare. If Indian kingdoms wanted to resist Portuguese dominance, they'd need to find other methods: diplomacy, alliances, guerrilla warfare on land. But at sea, the Portuguese ruled. After Diu, the Portuguese didn't just rest on their laurels. They refined their tactics, learning from every battle and adapting to local conditions. Let me walk you through the specific techniques that made Portuguese naval forces so devastatingly effective. The first tactic was what I call concentrated fire. Portuguese captains understood that spreading their shots across multiple enemy ships was less effective than concentrating all their cannons on one ship at a time. They'd identify the largest or most dangerous enemy vessel, and every Portuguese ship would focus its fire on that target until it was destroyed or disabled. Then they'd move to the next target. This created a psychological effect as much as a tactical one. Enemy fleet commanders would watch as their best ships were systematically destroyed, one after another. It was demoralizing in a way that random damage spread across the fleet wasn't. The second tactic was controlled aggression. This might sound like an oxymoron, but hear me out. Portuguese captains were aggressive in seeking out battle, but they were extremely controlled in how they fought. They wouldn't chase enemy ships into shallow water where they might run aground. They wouldn't break formation to pursue a tempting target if it meant exposing themselves to being surrounded. Portuguese fleet commanders maintained tight discipline. Ships stayed in formation. Captains followed orders. This kind of coordination was unusual in this era. Most naval battles of the time were chaotic free-for-alls, where individual ship captains made their own decisions. The Portuguese fought as a unified fleet, and that unity multiplied their effectiveness. The third tactic was strategic use of fear. The Portuguese deliberately cultivated a reputation for being ruthless and invincible. After battles, they would sometimes execute prisoners publicly or parade captured enemy banners through Portuguese-controlled ports. They spread stories about their victories, often exaggerating them. They wanted every captain in the Indian Ocean to think twice before fighting Portuguese ships. This wasn't just cruelty for its own sake, though there was certainly cruelty involved. It was a calculated strategy to avoid future battles. If everyone believed Portuguese ships were invincible, many potential enemies would surrender without a fight or pay for Cartazes rather than risk battle. The fourth tactic was economic warfare. The Portuguese didn't just fight naval battles, they strangled their enemies' economies. They'd blockade ports belonging to hostile rulers, preventing trade. They'd seize or destroy merchant ships, even if those ships weren't directly involved in hostilities. They'd offer favorable terms to merchants who cooperated and harsh punishment to those who didn't. This economic pressure forced many Indian Ocean powers to negotiate with the Portuguese even after military victories. A kingdom might win a land battle against Portuguese forces, but if Portuguese ships prevented all their trade, they'd quickly face economic collapse. The fifth tactic, and this was genius, was divide and conquer. The Portuguese understood that the Indian Ocean wasn't a unified political entity. There were Hindu kingdoms that didn't trust Muslim rulers. There were Muslim rulers who competed with each other. There were merchants who just wanted to trade and didn't care about politics. Portuguese diplomats and military commanders exploited every division. They'd ally with one Indian kingdom against another. They'd offer protection to Hindu merchants against Muslim pirates. They'd promise one ruler favorable trade terms in exchange for military support against his rivals. The Portuguese were vastly outnumbered in India, but they made sure they never had to fight everyone at once. One brilliant example of this tactic was their relationship with the Kingdom of Cochin. Cochin was a relatively small kingdom on the Malabar coast that was constantly threatened by the much more powerful Kingdom of Calicut. The Portuguese offered Cochin military protection in exchange for trading rights. This alliance gave the Portuguese a secure base in India and gave Cochin protection from its enemies. Both sides benefited, and the Portuguese used Cochin as a base to project power across the region. The sixth tactic was technological evolution. Whoa! The Portuguese didn't just build good ships, they constantly improved them. After every battle, captains would report what worked and what didn't. Portuguese shipwrights would incorporate these lessons into new vessels. Portuguese artillery officers would experiment with different types of cannons and ammunition. By the 1520s, Portuguese ships in the Indian Ocean were markedly superior to the ones that had fought at Diu. They were faster, more heavily armed, and more seaworthy. The Portuguese maintained a technological edge, not by making one breakthrough, but by continuously making small improvements. The seventh tactic was information dominance. The Portuguese created a network of spies, informants, and allies who kept them informed about enemy movements. They knew where enemy fleets were assembling, which rulers were planning to resist, which trade routes were most vulnerable. This intelligence allowed them to strike preemptively or position their forces where they'd be most effective. And the eighth tactic was perhaps the most important: strategic patience. The Portuguese understood that they couldn't control every mile of coast in the Indian Ocean. They didn't try to. Instead, they focused on controlling key strategic points, major ports, trade route choke points, islands that could serve as bases. They built fortresses at places like Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz. These weren't just trading posts. They were major military installations that could withstand sieges and serve as bases for Portuguese fleets. By controlling a few key positions, the Portuguese could dominate much larger areas. This strategy required patience. Sometimes Portuguese forces would lose minor battles or face setbacks, but as long as they held their key fortresses and maintained naval superiority, they could recover from those setbacks. Their enemies, meanwhile, needed to win every battle to have any hope of driving the Portuguese out. All of these tactics came together to create a system that was remarkably effective. The Portuguese didn't just win battles through superior firepower. They won through superior strategy, superior intelligence, superior economics, and superior diplomacy. They were outnumbered and far from home, but they thought systematically about how to project power, and that systematic thinking gave them an empire. Now let me explain how the Portuguese transformed their naval victories into lasting control of the Indian Ocean trade routes. Because winning battles is one thing, holding territory and controlling trade for decades is something else entirely. The Portuguese strategy was based on a network of fortified positions they called feitorias, or fortalezas. These weren't just warehouses or trading posts. They were military fortresses, built to European standards, garrisoned with soldiers and artillery, and positioned at strategic locations around the Indian Ocean. Let me walk you through the key positions in this network. The first and most important was Goa. The Portuguese captured Goa in 1510, the year after their victory at Diu. Goa was perfect for Portuguese needs, a natural harbour, a defensible position, and centrally located on India's west coast. Afonso de Albuquerque, the Portuguese governor, made Goa the capital of Portuguese India. But Goa wasn't just an administrative centre, it was a fortress that could withstand sieges by Indian armies. The Portuguese built massive stone walls, artillery bastions, and defensive towers. They stationed thousands of soldiers there, and they used Goa as a shipyard where they could repair damaged vessels and even build new ships without having to sail all the way back to Portugal. From Goa, Portuguese ships could patrol the entire west coast of India. Any ship wanting to trade along that coast needed a Portuguese cartaz, or it risked being captured. The Portuguese collected fees from thousands of merchant vessels every year, generating enormous revenue. The second key position was Hormuz, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. The Portuguese captured Hormuz in 1515, giving them control over the trade routes to Persia and Mesopotamia. Hormuz was fantastically wealthy. It was a major entrepot where goods from India, Africa, and Arabia all came together. By controlling Hormuz, the Portuguese could tax and control trade between the Indian Ocean and the Middle East. The third key position was Malacca, on the Malay Peninsula. Malacca was perhaps the most important of all Portuguese fortresses because it controlled the straits between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Every ship traveling between India and China had to pass through the Strait of Malacca. The Portuguese captured Malacca in 1511, and from that base they could dominate trade across Southeast Asia. These three fortresses, Goa, Hormuz, and Malacca, formed a triangle of Portuguese power. They were positioned at the key choke points of Indian Ocean trade, and between these fortresses, Portuguese ships patrolled constantly, enforcing the cartaz system and suppressing any remaining piracy. But the Portuguese didn't stop there. They established smaller fortified positions at dozens of other locations: Colombo in Sri Lanka, Cochin on the Malabar coast, Diu in Gujarat, Muscat in Oman, Mombasa on the east coast of Africa. Each of these positions was mutually supporting. If one was attacked, Portuguese ships from other fortresses could come to its aid. This network of fortresses served multiple purposes. First, obviously they were military bases. Second, they were trading posts where Portuguese factors could buy and sell goods. Third, they were intelligence centers, where Portuguese officials gathered information about local politics and trade. Fourth, they were symbols of Portuguese power, constant reminders to local populations that the Portuguese were here to stay. Maintaining these fortresses was enormously expensive. The Portuguese had to ship soldiers, supplies, and ammunition from Europe around Africa to India, a voyage that took 6 months and was incredibly dangerous. Ships were lost to storms, diseases killed soldiers, and the cost of maintaining a global empire strained Portugal's resources. But the profits from the spice trade more than paid for it. A ship that left Portugal loaded with trade goods and returned loaded with pepper, cinnamon, and cloves could generate profits of 500% or more. One successful voyage could pay for an entire fortress. The spice trade was literally funding the Portuguese Empire. The fortress strategy also had a darker side. The Portuguese weren't just controlling trade. They were often destroying traditional trading networks that had existed for centuries. Arab merchants who traded peacefully across the Indian Ocean for generations now found their ships seized if they didn't have Portuguese permission. Hindu and Muslim kingdoms that had coexisted and traded with each other now found themselves forced to choose sides in conflicts they didn't start. The Portuguese justified this by saying they were bringing order to lawless waters and protecting merchants from pirates. But from the perspective of most people in the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese themselves were the pirates. They were foreigners who'd arrived with superior weapons and used those weapons to force everyone else to pay them tribute. Despite this resistance, the fortress strategy worked. By 1520, Portuguese control of Indian Ocean trade was essentially complete. They didn't control every port or every trade route, but they controlled enough key positions that they could extract profits from the entire system. The fortresses also became cultural centers. Portuguese settlers arrived, bringing their language, religion, and customs. Churches were built, schools were established. Intermarriage between Portuguese settlers and local populations created mixed communities with their own unique cultures. Goa, in particular, became a blend of Portuguese and Indian influences that persists to this day. The military garrisons in these fortresses faced constant challenges. Tropical diseases killed soldiers faster than enemy action did. Malaria, dysentery, and other illnesses meant that a Portuguese soldier's life expectancy in India was measured in months, not years. Reinforcements were constantly needed, and recruiting soldiers willing to make the dangerous voyage to India was difficult. The Portuguese also faced periodic sieges. Local rulers would sometimes attempt to recapture fortresses, surrounding them with armies and cutting off supplies. The fortresses were designed to withstand these sieges. They had deep wells for water, storerooms for food, and enough ammunition to hold out for months. Portuguese ships would eventually arrive with reinforcements and drive off the besiegers. One of the most famous sieges was the Siege of Diu in 1538. The Gujarat Sultanate, supported by Ottoman Turkish artillery and advisors, surrounded the Portuguese fortress with a massive army. The siege lasted for months. The Portuguese garrison was down to its last supplies and nearly out of ammunition when a relief fleet arrived from Goa, broke the siege, and saved the fortress. These dramatic sieges became part of Portuguese national mythology. Stories of small garrisons holding out against overwhelming odds inspired Portuguese soldiers and sailors. They saw themselves as warriors defending Christianity against Islam, civilization against barbarism. Whether or not those narratives were accurate is debatable, but they were powerful motivators. The fortress strategy had one major weakness. It required constant naval superiority. If the Portuguese ever lost control of the sea lanes between their fortresses, the entire system would collapse. Each fortress would be isolated, unable to receive reinforcements or supplies. Enemies could pick them off one by one. This is why Portuguese naval victories like Diu were so crucial. As long as Portuguese ships dominated the Indian Ocean, the fortress network was secure. But if a powerful enemy ever assembled a fleet that could defeat Portuguese naval forces, the entire empire would be at risk. That threat would eventually come from the north, the Ottoman Turks. After conquering the Mamluk Sultanate in 1517, the Ottomans inherited the Mamluk desire to break Portuguese power in the Indian Ocean. The Ottomans had better ships and better artillery than the Mamluks. They would send multiple fleets to challenge the Portuguese in the 1530s and 1540s. But by then, the Portuguese fortress network was so well established that even the Ottomans couldn't break it. Ottoman fleets won some battles, but couldn't capture key fortresses. And without controlling those fortresses, they couldn't dominate the trade routes. The fortress strategy, combined with Portuguese naval power, had created a system that was remarkably resilient. It would take more than a century and the arrival of new European powers with their own advanced navies before Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean would finally be broken. Now let me talk about the long-term impact of Portuguese naval dominance in the Indian Ocean, because this wasn't just about one country controlling trade for a few decades. The Portuguese maritime empire changed the world in ways that are still felt today. First, let's talk about naval warfare. Before the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean, naval battles were primarily decided by boarding actions. Ships would close with each other, sailors would jump across with swords and spears, and whichever side had more men or better hand-to-hand fighters would win. Artillery existed, but it was secondary to boarding. The Portuguese proved that artillery could be the decisive factor in naval warfare. Ships designed as gun platforms with crews trained specifically in gunnery could defeat much larger fleets through firepower alone. This lesson wasn't lost on other European powers. Within a generation, every major European navy was copying Portuguese ship designs and tactics. The Spanish built galleons based on Portuguese carracks. The Dutch and English developed their own versions of sailing warships optimized for artillery. By the late 1500s, the naval warfare revolution that Portugal pioneered had spread across Europe. This had global consequences. European ships, with their superior artillery, could defeat larger Asian, African, or American fleets. This technological advantage was one of the key factors that enabled European colonialism over the next 3 centuries. The Portuguese had shown the way, and other European powers followed. Second, the Portuguese changed global trade patterns. Before Portuguese ships rounded Africa, the spice trade from Asia to Europe went through multiple middlemen and was controlled by Arab and Venetian merchants. After the Portuguese established their Indian Ocean Empire, spices increasingly went directly from Asia to Europe via Portuguese ships. This had enormous economic consequences. Venice, which had been one of the wealthiest cities in Europe thanks to its monopoly on spice imports, went into decline. Arab merchants who dominated Indian Ocean trade for centuries saw their profits and influence diminish. New trade routes and new economic centers emerged. The Portuguese also introduced new goods to global trade. They brought Indian textiles to Africa and Europe. They brought African goods to Asia. They connected economies that had previously been separate, creating what was arguably the first truly global trading system. Third, the Portuguese spread their language and culture across the Indian Ocean. Portuguese became a lingua franca for trade, used by merchants from different cultures who needed a common language. Portuguese loanwords entered dozens of Asian and African languages. Portuguese architectural styles influenced building designs from Brazil to Macau. The Portuguese also spread Christianity, though with mixed success. They established Catholic missions across Asia and Africa. Some of these missions created lasting Christian communities, like the Catholics of Goa or the Christians of Sri Lanka. Others faced resistance and achieved limited conversions. The Catholic Church's expansion into Asia during this period had lasting impacts on both Christianity and the regions they evangelized. It created new theological debates about how to adapt Christianity to non-European cultures. It led to the development of new missionary strategies, and it created communities of Asian Christians whose descendants still exist today. Fourth, the Portuguese created new models of imperial control. The fortress network strategy, the cartaz system, the combination of military power and trade monopolies, these became templates that other European colonial powers would copy and refine. The Dutch, when they broke Portuguese power in Southeast Asia in the 1600s, essentially copied the Portuguese system. They built their own fortresses, issued their own passes to ships, and dominated trade through a combination of naval power and strategic positions. The British East India Company would later use similar methods in India. Fifth, Portuguese exploration and mapping expanded European knowledge of the world dramatically. Portuguese sailors charted coastlines, recorded currents and winds, and created maps that other Europeans used for generations. Portuguese knowledge of Asian geography, cultures and politics was far superior to anything Europeans had previously known. This knowledge had scientific impacts. Portuguese observations contributed to better understanding of geography, astronomy, and navigation, but it also had imperial impacts. Portuguese maps and sailing directions helped later European powers follow in Portuguese footsteps, spreading European influence even further. Sixth, the Portuguese experience in the Indian Ocean provided lessons about the limits of naval power. The Portuguese controlled the seas, but they never controlled the interior of India or most other Asian regions. They had fortresses on the coasts, but inland they had little influence. This demonstrated something important. Naval superiority can control trade and coasts, but it can't conquer continental powers. The Portuguese could defeat any Asian fleet, but they couldn't defeat Asian armies inland. This reality shaped how Europeans approached colonialism in Asia for centuries. They focused on controlling ports and trade routes, not conquering kingdoms. The exception would come much later, when European powers developed sufficient technological advantages on land, railroads, telegraphs, machine guns, to conquer Asian territories. But in the 1500s and 1600s, naval power alone wasn't enough, and the Portuguese proved that. Seventh, Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean eventually provoked a reaction that led to their decline. Other European powers, especially the Dutch and the English, looked at Portuguese wealth from the spice trade and wanted it for themselves. They built their own fleets, developed their own trade networks, and eventually challenged Portuguese power. By the early 1600s, Portuguese dominance was fading. Dutch ships were capturing Portuguese fortresses. English ships were competing for trade. The Portuguese simply didn't have the population or resources to maintain a global empire, while also facing challenges in Europe from Spain and other powers. The lesson here is that maritime empires are vulnerable to competition. The Portuguese showed that controlling sea trade could generate enormous wealth, but that same demonstration ensured that they wouldn't be allowed to keep that monopoly forever. Success breeds imitators, and imitators eventually become competitors. Eighth, and this is crucial, the Portuguese maritime empire was built on violence. The victories I've described, the battles where Portuguese ships defeated Eastern fleets, came at enormous human cost. Thousands of Asian sailors and soldiers died in these battles. Countless merchants lost their livelihoods. Entire communities were disrupted or destroyed. The Portuguese justified this violence as necessary to establish order and spread Christianity. But we should be clear-eyed about what happened. This was conquest. The Portuguese used superior military technology to impose their will on people who had their own established ways of life. The fact that this conquest was motivated by profit and religion doesn't make it less violent. The legacy of Portuguese colonialism in places like Goa, Mozambique, and Timor-Leste is complicated. There are cultural connections and historical ties, but also histories of exploitation and oppression. Understanding this legacy requires acknowledging both the historical achievements and the human costs. Finally, the Portuguese maritime empire demonstrated something profound about the early modern world. Technology and organization could overcome enormous numerical disadvantages. 18 ships defeated a fleet of 200, not through luck or courage alone, but through superior ship design, superior artillery, superior tactics, and superior coordination. This principle, that technological and organizational advantages can be decisive, would shape the next 5 centuries of world history. It helps explain European colonialism, Western military dominance, and the global spread of certain technologies and ideas. The Portuguese were among the first to demonstrate this principle on a global scale, and the world has been living with the consequences ever since. We've journeyed through one of the most incredible naval stories in history. We've seen how a handful of Portuguese ships, thousands of miles from home, defeated massive fleets and established an empire that changed the world. We've explored the technology, the tactics, the battles, and the legacy of Portuguese naval dominance in the Indian Ocean. But here's the thing, history is full of incredible stories like this. Stories of impossible victories, technological revolutions, and the clash of civilizations. Stories that are every bit as dramatic and fascinating as anything Hollywood could create. And the best part? They actually happened. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that subscribe button. We're diving deep into more epic historical battles, exploring the technologies that changed warfare, and uncovering the stories that shaped our world. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Second, smash that like button. It helps this video reach more people who love history, and it tells me that you want more content like this. Your likes directly influence what videos I make next, so if you want more naval history, more battles, more technology deep dives, let me know by hitting that like button. Third, and this is the most important one, leave a comment telling me what your favorite historical naval battle is. Maybe it's the Battle of Trafalgar, where Nelson defeated the combined French and Spanish fleets. Maybe it's the Battle of Midway that turned the tide in the Pacific during World War II. Maybe it's an ancient battle like Salamis, where the Greeks defeated the Persian fleet. Whatever your favorite naval battle is, tell me in the comments. Tell me why it fascinates you. Tell me what you'd like to learn more about. I read every comment, and your suggestions directly influence the videos I make. This channel is a conversation, not a lecture. I want to explore the history that you're passionate about, and if you're not sure what your favorite naval battle is, that's okay too. Just leave a comment telling me what you thought of this video. Did the Battle of Diu surprise you? Do you think the Portuguese were innovative heroes or brutal conquerors? What do you think about the technology gap between European and Asian navies in this period? Let's discuss it in the comments. History isn't just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding how we got here, how technology shapes societies, how small groups can change the world, and how the decisions made centuries ago still affect us today. Every time you watch one of these videos, you're connecting with that history. You're learning lessons that schools often don't teach. You're seeing the world in a more nuanced, more informed way. So subscribe, like, and comment. Join this community of history enthusiasts who understand that the past is never really past. It's always present, always influencing us, always offering lessons if we're willing to listen. And if you want to go even deeper, check out the other videos on this channel. We've covered everything from ancient warfare to medieval sieges to the technological revolutions that changed how wars are fought. There's always more to learn, always more stories to discover, always more history to explore. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the story of Portuguese ships and the pirates of the East. Thank you for being curious about history. Thank you for being part of this community. Now hit that subscribe button, leave a comment with your favorite naval battle, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll explore another incredible chapter in human history. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. History is waiting. The story of how Portuguese ships defeated the pirates of the East is a story about technology, courage, strategy, and the often brutal realities of empire building. It's a story of men sailing halfway around the world with dreams of wealth and power. It's a story of battles against impossible odds and victories that changed history. But it's also a story that raises difficult questions. What price was paid for Portuguese dominance? Whose voices are missing from this narrative? How do we balance admiration for technological and tactical achievement with recognition of the violence and disruption that achievement caused? These are the questions that make history fascinating. Not just what happened, but why it happened, who it affected, and what it means for us today. The Portuguese maritime empire is long gone. The great carracks have rotted away. The battles have been forgotten by most people. But the legacy of what happened in those Indian Ocean waters 5 centuries ago still shapes our world. When you see a map of global trade routes, you're seeing patterns that were established in part by Portuguese ships. When you think about European colonialism and its lasting impacts, you're thinking about systems that the Portuguese helped create. When you study naval warfare, you're learning from innovations that Portuguese captains pioneered. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how the past created the present and how the present is creating the future. The story of Portuguese ships and Eastern pirates is ultimately a story about how the world became connected, how technology changes power dynamics, and how a few determined people can reshape their era. And that's a lesson worth remembering.